All right, so this video is meant for those who missed class when we talked about the information sheets or maybe is looking to review um, that information. So this will help you complete pages 79 and 80 in your binder, and hopefully some of the discussion here will help as well. So we talked about the League of Nations and how it was a miserable failure after World War I because of lack of participation from some of the major countries, especially the United States. Russia wasn't in it, Germany wasn't in it, obviously. And so after World War II, there was a renewed desire for a world body that was tasked with stopping another world war, preventing another world war. And so that's the United Nations. And the big difference here is that this is everybody, even enemies. And we know how the United States and the Soviet Union had this big rivalry. Both of them are in the United Nations. So even countries that don't get along are in the United Nations. And that's one of the things that really makes it go. So on page 79 in your notes, you'll see actually, let's just go ahead and do both. Level two, all countries coming together, social, economic, political, military issues. We'll talk about that obviously when we get to the Korean War. But again, the main point here, level three ideas, this is everybody. And one of the lessons learned from the League of Nations was that in order to prevent a larger conflict, sometimes you have to engage in a smaller conflict. And a good example of that is the United Nations going to war in Korea in order to prevent that from unraveling into World War III. Alger Hiss was accused of being a communist spy. He maintained his innocence. He's a good representation of the fear that many Americans had about communists in the United States and how they may be working against the United States and being allies of the Soviet Union in our borders, especially when they, like Hiss, worked in the government. And so he was convicted of perjury and just other crimes like that. But it's a good example of people being freaked out, people being paranoid, and this idea that communist spies are in the United States, and we'll see that echoed in a story a little bit later. Looking back overseas, one of the concerns we talked about of communism spreading was through invasion or subversion. I'm sorry, not invasion, was through subversion or revolution. And countries of Greece and Turkey were particularly vulnerable to that in the late 1940s. And so what President Truman decided to do was give them money. So one of the ways in which the United States tried to stop the spread of communism was to give money. And this is to stabilize their government, to stabilize their economic structure so that communist revolution didn't seem as appealing to the people. So is that a bribe? Not really. It's trying to make the country better so that it doesn't devolve into a communist country from a U.S. point of view. So this is a great example of containment policy. Containment policy with the Korean War was going to war. With the Truman Doctrine, it's giving money. But again, it's all in an effort to stop the spread of communism. Another example like that is the Marshall Plan. Obviously, Western Europe was devastated from World War II. This guy is General George Marshall. He's Secretary of State under Harry Truman. General Marshall tours Western Europe after the war, and he sees utter devastation, homelessness, starvation, and he wants to do something to help. So he and the president come up with the Marshall Plan, and it's $13 billion to help Western Europe rebuild from World War II. The secondary benefit here is that if those countries are stable, if there are roofs over heads and food in bellies, then again, communism doesn't seem as appealing as it otherwise might. So both the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan give money. The difference here is that Marshall Plan's primary focus was to help rebuild. It's the secondary benefit of helping to stop the spread of communism that applies to this particular theme. Ooh, some of the map is cut off here, but that's okay. We know that Europe or Germany was divided. We also see that Berlin itself was divided. So, in an effort to cut off, to try and get the Allies out, in 1948, the Soviets cut off rail access and road access into Western Berlin, trying to starve the 2 million people of Western Berlin and get the Allies to just up and leave. But that would be appeasement if the Allies did that. So we don't want to let Soviet aggression get rewarded. So what the Allies did, what the United States did, was load up a bunch of planes every single day, all day, every day for almost a year, and fly into Western Berlin, unload, fly back, fly into Western Berlin, unload. So that's how they supplied the 2 million people of Western Berlin with food, clothes, fuel, all of the stuff that they were going to need. That was cut off due to the blockade. So don't want to give in to Soviet aggression. This is a great example of that. So the airlift itself is impressive, but standing up to aggression shows that the United States and other countries learned their lesson from World War II. You have to stand up to aggression. NATO stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It is kind of like the United Nations. It's a collection of nations working together, but unlike the United Nations, this isn't everybody. This is just the blue countries you see here on the map. Um, it is a defense organization against communist aggression. So if the Soviet Union or a communist country expands and wants to expand into Western Europe, it's going to be NATO that goes to war. So it's these countries and Canada and the United States and the defense organization against communism. So if Soviet Union wanted to attack, Netherlands, it was going to be considered an attack on all of them. So they're all going to come to everybody's aid, and so that's meant to be a deterrent. So to the Soviet Union, maybe don't do that because you don't want World War III. And for the most part, it worked. Back in the United States, HUAC is the House Un-American Activities Committee. It's an investigative body of the House of Representatives that was tasked with investigating during the Cold War, investigating communists within the United States. That sounds simple and noble enough, but it turned into, for lack of a better term, a witch hunt. And there were a lot of people who were accused of doing stuff they didn't actually do. And the theme becomes that accusations were treated as fact, and just because someone who was accused of being a communist meant that they were assumed to be a communist without necessarily any evidence or enough evidence. And so it's almost like oppression existed in the United States in our attempt to protect ourselves from oppression. So it's kind of it's an expression of this fear and paranoia, and it's a regrettable um, facet of the Cold War. Um, Sort of the innocent until proven guilty was out the window here. The Rosenbergs, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, were accused of being communist spies and were convicted and sentenced to death and were executed via the electric chair. And the thing to keep in mind about these guys is that they are normal people. They lived in the suburbs. They have two sons. They just look like anybody else. They don't necessarily look like communist spies. And so this breeds the idea in the country that anybody can be a spy. They could be everywhere. And if you couple that with HUAC and McCarthyism, people were really freaked out about communism and the idea that it could be within our own borders working against us. Sputnik was the first artificial satellite, the first man-made object put into space, which in 2018 seems rather dull, but in 1957, when it was launched, was a towering scientific achievement. To build a rocket powerful enough to escape Earth's gravity and get into outer space was very impressive. And the fact that the Soviets did it first was deeply embarrassing to the United States. Um, it also meant that if the Soviets could put an object into outer space, they could also maybe put a bomb on the end of a rocket and point it at the United States. And now it's not uh, getting attacked by atomic bomber planes. It's missiles, and that is particularly scary. This also led to the creation of NASA and a focus on science and math education. Up until this point, the United States had been confident that they were technologically ahead of the Soviet Union, who they regarded as being rather dumb. But this proved that this wasn't the case. And for the next 10 years or so, the United States was consistently, at least in the space race, behind the Soviets. Cuba in the 1950s turns communist. A guy named Fidel Castro takes over, and this is concerning to the United States because Cuba is right next to the United States. And to have an ally of the Soviet Union so close to America freaked a lot of Americans out, especially those in power. So the idea here was we could help inspire a counter-revolution against the Cubans or against the communist Cuban government. So rather than having the U.S. invade Cuba, which would look really bad, a huge country invading a small country, there were a bunch of opponents of Castro that fled to the United States, Cuban exiles. We took 1,500 of them, or 2,000 or something, it doesn't matter, armed them, trained them, and sent them into Cuba as the invading force, hoping that that would inspire a counter-revolution. It didn't. It was an abysmal, huge failure. It was a plan that was drawn up under Eisenhower, but was executed under Kennedy because he became president in 1961 when the plan was ready. And it didn't work. And Castro stayed in power and actually pushed him closer to the Soviet Union and just was a big, big embarrassment. So, in their zeal to rid this side of the world of communists, that uh, led to some bad decisions being made. In 1961, also in 1961, the Soviets put a wall around West Berlin. Remember, West Berlin is occupied by the Allies, East Berlin by the Soviets. So this is the good guy side, this is the bad guy side. And a bunch of people from the bad guy side were going to the good guy side because the bad guy side sucked. So rather than improve conditions in East Berlin, the Soviets built a wall around West Berlin, not to keep West Berliners in, but to prevent East Berliners or East Germans from getting into to West Berlin. So they built a wall. It just went up overnight, barricades, and then finally a concrete wall and pretty sophisticated structures here. And an actual barrier, unlike the Iron Curtain. It was an actual barrier, and it served also as a symbol of the divide between East and West. And when it came down in 1989, it was a sign that the Cold War was almost over. And the culmination of all of this is in 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is the closest that the United States and the Soviet Union and the world ever came to nuclear war. We were literally minutes away from a nuclear war that would have killed millions and millions of people. The Soviets had put missiles in Cuba to essentially even the playing field. We had missiles pointed at the Soviet Union. They didn't have missiles pointed at us, so this would kind of balance things out. But from a U.S. perspective, it seemed like they were getting ready to attack the United States. So the question for the U.S. government is, how do we get those out of there? Do we invade? Do we bomb? What do we do to get these missiles out? And eventually, what was decided was that a blockade was going to be put around Cuba to buy some time, and we were able to negotiate our way out of it. But it did seem like this is going to be it. This is going to be World War III, and this is the crescendo of all of this, and the height of the what I call the "we're all going to die" phase of the Cold War. And so while the Cold War doesn't end after this, it continues. It's not quite as tense and as we're going to kill everybody type thinking after that, because it was so scary at the time. Um, so I know I went through these kind of fast, even though the video may not have seemed very fast. If you have questions about these, please let me know, because all of these are important in understanding the overall themes of the Cold War.